The morning Diane Hargrove knocked on my truck window and slapped a fine notice against the glass, I was sitting in my own driveway, bundled in 3 layers, watching the thermometer on my dashboard read -14 degrees Fahrenheit. -14. Not cold, not chilly, not brisk. -14. The kind of cold that makes your nose hairs freeze the second you step outside. The kind of cold that turns a cup of coffee into a lukewarm slush in under 4 minutes. The kind of cold that makes every sensible human being in the Northern Hemisphere ask the simple, reasonable question: why would I turn my engine off? I had been sitting in my truck for about 20 minutes, letting the heater do its job before I climbed out and fired up the snowplow blade I had rigged to the front of my F-250. That plow had been keeping Maplewood Estates' private road clear all winter under a contract I had signed with the HOA back in October. A contract they were very happy about when the first big snow hit in November, and every single resident could still get their minivans and sedans out without getting buried up to the bumpers. They were real friendly back in November. But that was before Diane Hargrove decided she had nothing better to do on a -14-degree Tuesday morning than walk from her heated house, down her heated front walk, across the icy street, and tap on my window to tell me I was in violation of Community Rule 742, which she claimed prohibited the prolonged idling of motor vehicles within the Maplewood Estates community to preserve air quality and reduce noise pollution. I rolled the window down about 3 inches. The blast of Arctic air that hit me was immediate and savage. "Good morning, Rick," she said, holding out a small yellow slip like she was handing me a parking ticket from a meter maid. Her breath was coming out in little white clouds and her wool coat was pulled up around her ears, which told me she was already freezing and had been outside for maybe 45 seconds. Meanwhile, she was fining me for trying to stay warm. I looked at the slip. $100 for idling my truck in my own driveway. I looked back at Diane. She had that look she always had, the one that said she had been waiting for this moment, that she had been planning it, that this was somehow a highlight of her morning. Diane Hargrove was the kind of HOA board member who read the community rule book the way some people read the Bible, looking for passages to justify whatever she had already decided to do. She was in her mid-50s, kept immaculate records of every perceived infraction in the neighborhood, and had appointed herself the de facto queen of Maplewood Estates some years back when she had been elected HOA treasurer, and then, through a combination of manipulation, attrition, and the fact that nobody else wanted the job, ended up as the de facto head of the 3-person board. I did not take the slip. I just stared at it. "You've been idling for over 15 minutes, Rick," she said, like she had been out there timing me with a stopwatch, which honestly, knowing Diane, she might have been. Rule 742 is very clear. Vehicles may not idle for more than 5 consecutive minutes within the community. "Diane," I said, keeping my voice level, "it's -14 degrees outside. I'm warming the truck up so I can plow your road." She smiled. Not a warm smile. A smile that said she had anticipated this exact objection and had her counter already loaded. The rule doesn't make exceptions for temperature, Rick, and it also doesn't distinguish between personal use and contracted use. A violation is a violation. I looked at the yellow slip again. I looked at the snowplow blade attached to the front of my truck, which was literally the only reason anyone in Maplewood Estates could get their car out of their driveway. I looked at Maplewood Lane, the private road that wound through the neighborhood, which had about 6 inches of fresh snow on it from the storm that had blown through overnight. 6 inches of dense, packed, heavy snow that was currently sitting between every single resident and the outside world. I took the slip. Not because I agreed with it, not because I thought for 1 second that Diane was right. I took it because I was raised to be polite and because I needed both hands to roll my window back up against the cold. The second the glass sealed and the heater hit me again, something crystallized in my brain with the same sharp clarity that the ice was crystallizing on every surface in Maplewood Estates. I was done. Not dramatically done. Not screaming and yelling done. Just quietly, calmly, logically done. I had a contract to plow the community road. That contract had a clause I had insisted on when I negotiated it, a clause that Diane herself had signed off on, which stated that in the event of a dispute regarding payment or working conditions related to the contracted services, I reserved the right to suspend services pending resolution of said dispute. I had put that clause in there because I had dealt with HOAs before. I had dealt with people like Diane before. And I had known, somewhere in the back of my mind, that eventually this day would come. The fine was the dispute. The working condition was the ability to warm my truck in my own driveway before operating heavy equipment in sub-zero temperatures. I put the truck in reverse, backed out of my driveway, and pulled up to the entrance of Maplewood Lane. I sat there for a moment, looking at the unplowed road stretching out ahead of me, 6 inches of snow waiting to be cleared, and I made my decision. I put the truck in drive, pulled forward past the entrance, and turned onto the county road, which had been cleared and salted by the county highway department 2 hours ago. I drove to the gas station 3 miles up the road, got a large coffee, and called my friend Dale, who was also a licensed contractor, and told him the whole story. Dale's response was a long silence followed by a laugh that nearly blew out my phone speaker. "Fined you for idling in your own driveway," he said, "on the same morning you were about to plow the road she needs to get out of the neighborhood." "Yep," I said, "and the contract has your suspension clause." "Yep," I said. "Rick, buddy, enjoy that coffee. This is going to be beautiful." I sat at the gas station for about 45 minutes. I drank my coffee. I called my lawyer friend, a guy named Paul Jarity who had helped me draft the original contract, and I explained the situation to him. Paul was delighted. He told me the fine was almost certainly unenforceable as written, because Rule 742, when he looked it up in the community guidelines I had already emailed him, contained language that was specific to recreational and non-essential idling, and did not, by any reasonable legal interpretation, apply to a contracted service vehicle warming its engine before performing the contracted service. He said I should document everything, which I was already doing, and that I should send a formal notice of service suspension to the HOA board citing the dispute. I drafted the notice on my phone right there in the gas station parking lot, sent it to Paul. He cleaned it up in about 10 minutes and sent it back, and I emailed it to all 3 HOA board members. The other 2 board members were a retired pharmacist named Gerald who mostly agreed with Diane because she scared him, and a younger woman named Teresa who had moved in 18 months ago and who I happened to know was already deeply frustrated with Diane's management style. I CC'd all 3 of them. Then I drove home by the county road, parked in my garage, went inside, made breakfast, and waited. The calls started about 2 hours later. The first one was from Gerald, who sounded panicked and was clearly calling from somewhere cold, because his voice had that slightly compressed, too careful tone people get when they're standing outside. He said several residents were having trouble getting out of the neighborhood and wanted to know when I was coming to plow. I explained, politely and clearly, that I had sent a formal suspension notice related to the fine that had been issued that morning, and that services would resume once the dispute was formally resolved by the board. Gerald made a sound like a man who had just realized the yogurt he was eating had been expired for 2 weeks. "Can you at least clear a path?" he asked. "Gerald," I said, "the contract is suspended pending dispute resolution. I'd recommend the board review the notice I sent and schedule an emergency session." He hung up before I finished the sentence. The second call was from Teresa, and her tone was completely different. She was calling from inside her house. Her voice was crisp and clear, and the first thing she said was, "Rick, I read the notice. I think you're completely right, and I'm trying to figure out how to convene an emergency board meeting so we can dismiss this fine and get you back out there." "I appreciate that, Teresa," I said. The suspension clause is there for exactly this kind of situation. I can't be expected to operate heavy equipment in -14-degree weather without being able to warm my vehicle first. The fine was unreasonable, and I'd argue it's not even valid under the rule's own language. Agreed, she said. I'm going to call an emergency meeting for this afternoon. Can you stand by? I'll be here, I said. The third call, predictably, was from Diane. Diane did not sound panicked. Diane sounded furious, which was different. Fury in Diane's voice was a very controlled thing, very tightly wound, like a spring that was about to snap but hadn't yet. Rick, she said, I received your notice. I want you to understand that a legitimate fine issued under the community guidelines does not constitute a dispute, as defined by your contract. I had been waiting for this, because I knew Diane well enough to know she would come back with exactly that angle. I had already talked to Paul about it. Diane, I said, the contract defines a dispute as any disagreement arising from the performance of contracted services, including disagreements related to working conditions. Warmth and vehicle safety, in sub-zero, weather is absolutely a working condition. Additionally, Paul Jarrety reviewed Rule 742 this morning, and his opinion, which I'm happy to share in writing, is that the rule does not apply to contracted service vehicles under the plain language of the rule, so the fine itself is likely invalid. Both of those things together constitute a dispute, and the contract is suspended until the board resolves it. There was a pause on Diane's end, a long one. You're holding the neighborhood hostage, she said. I'm exercising a contractual right, I said, which is something you just did to me, Diane. You exercised a rule, whether valid or not, and issued a fine. I'm exercising a contractual right in response. Same principle. Another pause. This isn't over, she said. I know, I said, and I meant it genuinely and without malice, because I had been around long enough to know that with people like Diane, things like this were never simply over. They escalated until something forced a real resolution. I had known this was coming for a while, honestly. The fine was just the trigger. She hung up. I poured myself another cup of coffee and looked out my kitchen window at Maplewood Lane, which was sitting under its 6 inches of undisturbed, unplowed snow, looking peaceful and pristine and absolutely impassable. By noon, I was getting texts from my neighbors. People I knew and liked, regular folks who had nothing to do with the HOA politics. My neighbor 2 doors down, a guy named Frank Bellamy who drove a school bus, texted me to say he had to call in because he couldn't get out of the neighborhood. A woman named Carolyn Park, who lived at the far end of the lane, texted to say her elderly mother was visiting, and if there was a medical emergency, she wasn't sure an ambulance could get in. A guy named Tom Herrera, who ran a small landscaping business and was absolutely not working in January but still had errands to run, texted to say he had tried to push through in his SUV and gotten stuck trying to back out of his driveway. I answered every one of them honestly. I told them what had happened. I told them about the fine, about the rule, about the contract clause, about the suspension. I sent them all a copy of the notice I had sent to the board. Every single one of them responded with some variation of the same reaction: disbelief, then anger, then support. Frank Bellamy, who was a big, good-natured man who had never said a harsh word about anyone in the 3 years I had known him, texted back a message that said, simply, "Diane did what?" Carolyn Park texted back that she had been fed up with Diane for 2 years and asked if there was anything she could do to help. Tom Herrera sent me a voice message that was mostly him laughing and saying he couldn't believe it. By 1 in the afternoon, the group text thread that the Maplewood Estates residents had for neighborhood communication, the one that was normally used for things like, "Does anyone know whose dog got out?" and "Reminder that recycling goes on Wednesdays," was absolutely on fire. People were posting screenshots of Rule 742, debating its language, sharing Paul Jarrety's written opinion that I had forwarded to Teresa, and that Teresa had apparently shared with the group. and generally having the kind of community conversation that Diane had probably never anticipated when she walked across the street that morning with her yellow slip. Diane herself posted in the group thread once a carefully worded message about how the HOA was working to resolve the situation and that she was confident services would resume shortly, and that the fine had been issued in good faith per community guidelines. The responses she got back were not kind. Carolyn Park replied within 2 minutes, pointing out that issuing a fine to the contractor you depend on, in the middle of winter, in -14-degree weather, for warming his truck before plowing, was not, by any reasonable definition, good faith. Frank Bellamy replied that he had missed a full day of work. Tom Herrera replied with a very straightforward question about whether the HOA board was going to cover his towing bill, since he had needed a tow to get unstuck from his own driveway. Gerald, bless his heart, posted a message saying the board was scheduling an emergency meeting for 3 o'clock that afternoon and asking everyone to please remain patient. By 2:30, I had put on my coat and boots and walked down the street to check on Carolyn Park's mother, because I had seen the message about a potential medical situation, and I wanted to make sure she was okay. She was fine, as it turned out. She was a tiny 78-year-old woman named Helen who was perfectly healthy, slightly annoyed about being stuck, and absolutely fascinated by the drama. When I explained what had happened, she sat forward in her chair and said, "So this Diane woman fined you for sitting in your truck to stay warm before you plowed her road, and then you just didn't plow it." "That's pretty much it," I said. Helen nodded slowly, the way very old and very wise people sometimes nod when the world confirms something they have long suspected. "Good for you," she said. I walked back home through the snow, which was crunching under my boots in that particular way it does when it gets really, truly cold, the way where each step makes a sound like someone snapping a thick piece of cardboard. The sky was that flat, pale gray that means more snow is coming. The wind had picked up a little. Maplewood Lane stretched out on either side of me, smooth and white and untouched, and I felt absolutely fine about it, because I had exercised a legitimate contractual right in response to an illegitimate fine, and that was the beginning and end of it as far as I was concerned. The emergency board meeting was at 3 o'clock, held over video call because nobody wanted to go anywhere in the cold, which was somewhat ironic given that they couldn't have gone anywhere even if they wanted to, because the road was unplowed. I was invited to join the call as the contracted party in the dispute. Diane ran the meeting the way she always ran meetings, which was to say she had a prepared agenda and talked over anyone who tried to go off script. Her position was that the fine was valid, that my contract suspension was an overreaction, and that I should resume services immediately and pursue any grievances through the HOA's formal appeals process, which would take 60 days. 60 days. In January, in Minnesota. Teresa, to her enormous credit, did not let that stand for even 30 seconds. She pointed out that 60 days was not a reasonable timeline for a dispute that was actively preventing residents from leaving the neighborhood, that Paul Jarity's opinion called the fine's validity into serious question, and that the board had a fiduciary and community duty to resolve the dispute immediately. Gerald sat on the video call saying nothing useful, turning his head back and forth between Diane and Teresa like he was watching a very cold tennis match. Diane tried to steer the conversation toward a compromise where I would resume plowing immediately, and the fine would be reviewed within the standard 60-day window. She framed it very carefully, using language about community responsibility and professional obligations. I let her finish. Then I said, "Diane, with respect, if the board can't resolve a simple contractual dispute in an afternoon, that tells me the fine is going to remain in limbo for 60 days and then be upheld, and I'll have plowed all winter while a bogus fine sits on my account. The contract suspension clause exists precisely to prevent that situation. I'm happy to resume services the moment the fine is formally dismissed, and the board confirms in writing that contracted service vehicles are not subject to Rule 742 while performing their contracted duties. Diane started talking over me. Teresa talked over Diane. Gerald made a suggestion that nobody heard because they were both talking. I sat there quietly and let them sort it out. It took about 12 more minutes, but eventually Teresa called for a formal vote on dismissing the fine. Teresa voted yes. Gerald, after an agonizing pause that probably took 5 years off his life, voted yes. Diane voted no. 2-1, the fine was dismissed. Diane did not take it gracefully. She said the board was setting a precedent for contractors to hold the community hostage. Teresa, who had clearly been saving this up for some time, said the board had set the precedent by issuing a fine with no legal basis to a contractor working in dangerous temperatures, and that the real lesson here was that the HOA needed to be more thoughtful before issuing fines. Diane muted herself, which on a video call is the equivalent of going into another room and slamming the door. I got the written confirmation from Teresa via email before the call had even ended. She typed fast. I appreciated that about her. I had my plow blade on the front of my truck and was pulling out of my garage within 15 minutes of the call ending. The snow on Maplewood Lane had been sitting for most of the day by that point and had compacted a little in the cold, which made it slightly harder to move, but nothing the F-250 couldn't handle. I made my first pass down the center of the road, and the white wall of snow curled off to the right like a wave, and when I looked in my rearview mirror, I could see the dark, clear asphalt emerging behind me, and I felt something deeply satisfying about that. The kind of satisfaction that comes from doing a job well after someone has tried very hard to make it complicated. I plowed for 2 hours. Cleared the main road, cleared the turnaround at the end of the lane, cleared the access path to the mailbox cluster near the entrance, and did a second pass to clean up the edges. By the time I was done, the temperature had dropped another 4 degrees and it was dark, and there were Christmas lights still up on a few of the houses because it was early January and nobody had gotten around to taking them down yet, and they reflected off the freshly cleared snow in a way that made the whole neighborhood look genuinely pretty. Frank Bellamy came out of his house and waved at me from his driveway. I stopped and rolled my window down. "Appreciate it, Rick," he said. "No problem," I said. "You hear Diane's already drafting a complaint to submit to the HOA's legal counsel about your suspension of services." I had not heard that, but I wasn't surprised. "She's welcome to," I said. "Paul Jarrety is welcome to respond." Frank laughed. "I'm coming to the next HOA meeting," he said. "First one I've been to in 4 years. "Bring Carolyn Park," I said. "Already texted her," he said. The next HOA general meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening, and I'll tell you, I have never seen so many Maplewood Estates residents in one place. The meetings were normally held in Diane's living room, which seated about 8 people comfortably. 15 people showed up, which meant half of them were standing in the hallway and kitchen, and the overall energy in the room was not what you would call friendly toward the board. Diane had prepared an agenda. She always prepared an agenda. This one included a review of recent contractor management issues as a line item, which was her way of trying to frame the whole situation on her terms before the room could frame it differently. She did not get very far with that agenda. Carolyn Park went first, before Diane had even finished the opening formalities. Carolyn had printed out Rule 742, Paul Jarrety's written opinion, the fine notice, my suspension notice, and the vote record from the emergency meeting, and she had assembled all of it into a neat little packet that she distributed to every person in the room. Diane looked at those packets the way a cat looks at a glass of water someone has placed directly in front of it, with barely concealed alarm and profound offense. Carolyn said calmly and clearly that she wanted the full community to understand what had happened. She walked through the timeline: the negative 14-degree morning, the fine for idling, the contract suspension, the day with an unplowed road, Frank missing work, Tom getting stuck, her own concern about her mother and emergency access. Then she held up Paul Jarrett's opinion and said that the fine had not been legally supported under the community's own rules, and that the board had voted 2-1 to dismiss it, which meant the fine should never have been issued in the first place. Diane tried to interject twice. Both times, other residents talked over her, which was a thing that I had genuinely never seen happen to Diane before. She had always controlled these meetings through sheer force of personality and preparation. But when 15 people are in your living room and 12 of them are angry, preparation only gets you so far. Tom Herrera brought up the towing bill. He had the receipt in his hands. He said he had gotten stuck in his own driveway because the road was unplowed, and he wanted to know if the HOA was going to reimburse him for the tow. Gerald looked like he wanted to dissolve into the floor. Diane said the towing situation was an unfortunate consequence of a dispute that had since been resolved. Tom said the dispute had been created by the HOA, so the HOA's insurance should cover the consequence. Diane said that was not how HOA insurance worked. Tom said he had talked to his own insurance agent, and actually, it was very much potentially how HOA insurance worked, and that if the HOA wasn't willing to discuss it, he was happy to file a formal claim. More papers were being distributed around the room. Someone had printed out the HOA's own bylaws, specifically the section about board members' duties and the requirement that board actions serve the community interest. Teresa, sitting slightly apart from Diane and Gerald, had the look of someone who had been waiting a long time for this particular evening and was not unhappy about how it was going. The conversation eventually turned, as these things do when enough people are finally paying attention, to the broader pattern of Diane's management of the HOA. Things that people had been grumbling about privately for years started coming out into the open room. The fine that had been issued to the Nguyen family on the other side of the neighborhood for having a basketball hoop in their driveway, a hoop they used with their kids on weekends, because Rule 411 prohibited permanent recreational fixtures, even though the hoop was portable and not permanent. The selective enforcement of the holiday decoration rules, which seemed to apply to everyone except the two houses closest to Diane's. The assessment increase from the previous year that had been approved by the board without a community vote, which several people pointed out was potentially outside the board's authority under the HOA's governing documents. I mostly sat and listened. This wasn't my crusade. My piece of it had been resolved when the fine was dismissed, but I wasn't going to stop people from having a conversation that was clearly long overdue. Toward the end of the meeting, Teresa made a formal motion that the board commission an independent review of all fines issued in the previous 2 years to verify that they had been correctly applied under the community rules. She said the costs of the review would come from the HOA's administrative budget. Gerald seconded the motion before Diane could even open her mouth. It passed 2-1. Diane sat very still after that vote. Her agenda was sitting on the table in front of her, almost entirely untouched. She had written things like contractor protocol review and community appearance standards update on it, and none of it had happened. Frank Bellamy leaned over to me on his way out and said quietly, "I think that's the first time I've ever seen Diane look like the room wasn't on her side." "I think you're right," I said. "How's that feel?" he asked. "Pretty good," I said honestly. I should probably tell you that I thought the whole thing was winding down at that point. Fine dismissed, community engaged, review commissioned. I figured Diane would stew for a while, the review would happen, a few fines would be walked back, things would settle into a new normal where the board was a little more careful about throwing its weight around. Reasonable resolution. I was ready to move on. But then, about a week later, Teresa called me. Her voice had a particular quality to it that I had not heard before, a kind of careful steadiness that told me something had happened that she was still processing. She said she needed to tell me something about the HOA's finances. She said she had been going over the records in preparation for the independent review, and she had found some things that she was not comfortable explaining away as administrative errors. She found that over the course of the previous year and a half, there had been a series of transfers from the HOA's reserve fund, the fund that was supposed to cover major repairs and infrastructure maintenance, to an account that she could only describe as a pass-through. Small amounts, each one under $500, each one documented as administrative operating expenses in the ledger. Individually, they would never have triggered a second look. Together, over 18 months, they added up to just under $11,000. She had not been able to find corresponding receipts, invoices, or any documentation for those administrative expenses. And Diane Hargrove, as HOA treasurer, was the sole signatory on all of those transfers. I asked Teresa if she was sure about what she was looking at. She said she had gone over the records 3 times, and she had also shown them to her brother-in-law, who was a CPA, and he had told her that what she was describing sounded like embezzlement. There was a long silence on my end of the phone. I told Teresa she needed to call the police, and she needed to not touch those records any further until she had talked to someone with legal authority. I told her I could connect her with Paul Jarrety if she needed a lawyer to help her navigate reporting it. She said she had already talked to her brother-in-law about that, and they were planning to call the county sheriff's office the next morning. I told her she was doing the right thing. She asked me if I thought Diane had actually stolen the money, or if there was some innocent explanation. I thought about Diane Hargrove, who had walked across an icy street in -14°, whether to fine me $100 for idling my truck in my own driveway. I thought about the basketball hoop fine and the selective decoration enforcement and the assessment increase that had bypassed community approval. I thought about the way Diane ran her HOA meetings like a personal fiefdom, the way she talked over people, the way she had tried to frame the contract suspension as me holding the neighborhood hostage rather than a natural consequence of her own unreasonable action. I think you should let the investigation tell you that, I said carefully. Just get the records to the right people. She did. The county sheriff's office sent an investigator to talk to Teresa 2 days later. The investigator was a quiet, thorough woman named Deputy Anhuser who took all of the financial records and spent about 3 hours going through them at Teresa's kitchen table. She asked for all of the HOA's banking records going back 3 years, which Teresa provided. She also asked who had access to the HOA's records and who the other board members were. Gerald was interviewed by phone that afternoon. He sounded, by all accounts, like a man who was finally relieved to be able to tell someone what he knew, which turned out to be more than anyone had expected. Gerald confirmed that he had questioned several of the administrative transfers at the time and had been told by Diane that they were routine operating costs and that the documentation had been filed separately in a system that only Diane managed. He also confirmed that Diane had been the one to push the reserve fund transfers through and that he had signed off on them at her urging without fully reviewing the underlying documentation, a fact he seemed genuinely ashamed of. I found out most of this from Teresa, who was keeping me loosely updated because I had become something of an accidental central figure in the whole situation. I had not intended to unravel anything this significant when I drove past the entrance of Maplewood Lane that cold Tuesday morning. I had just wanted to drink my coffee in peace, but that's sometimes how these things work. You pull one loose thread, the kind that's been dangling in plain sight for years while everyone walked past it, and the whole sweater starts to unravel. Diane was interviewed by the sheriff's investigator on a Friday afternoon. I wasn't there for that, obviously, but word travels fast in a small neighborhood, and I heard from 3 different people within the hour that a county sheriff's vehicle had been parked in Diane's driveway for 2.5 hours. The investigation took about 3 weeks. It was not a long investigation, because the records were not complicated once someone who knew what they were looking for actually looked at them. The $11,000 had been transferred in a pattern that was consistent, methodical, and obviously designed to stay under the threshold that would trigger automatic review. Deputy Anhuser found a separate personal bank account in Diane's name that had received deposits matching the amounts and timing of the HOA transfers. They found records of those funds being used for personal expenses. Diane Hargrove was arrested on a Thursday morning, 6 weeks after the morning she had walked across the street to find me for idling my truck. The charge was financial fraud and misappropriation of HOA funds, which is a felony under state law when it exceeds a certain threshold. $11,000 exceeded that threshold. I heard about the arrest from Frank Bellamy, who texted me a message that said simply, "Did you see what happened to Diane this morning?" I had not. I was in my garage doing maintenance on the plow blade at the time. I went inside, made coffee, sat down at my kitchen table and thought about the whole sequence of events from the beginning. A cold Tuesday morning, a yellow slip, a truck heater running in a driveway, a road left unplowed for a day, a meeting, an audit, $11,000, an arrest. All of it connected in one long chain that started with a fine that should never have been issued. I am not a person who believes that things happen for a reason, in some grand cosmic sense. But I do believe that when someone with power over a community abuses that power in small, visible ways, it is usually because they are also abusing it in larger, less visible ways. The basketball hoop fine and the idling fine and the selective enforcement and the unauthorized assessment increase were all symptoms of someone who had decided the rules applied to everyone except herself. And the embezzlement was the same impulse taken one step further. If she could find me $100 for staying warm in my own driveway, she could move $500 from the reserve fund and call it an operating expense. The HOA held a special general meeting 2 weeks after the arrest, and this time it was not held in Diane's living room. It was held at the community clubhouse at the end of the lane, and every single homeowner in Maplewood Estates showed up. Teresa ran the meeting. Gerald attended and made a genuine, heartfelt apology to the community for not having scrutinized the finances more closely when he had questions. People appreciated that. Gerald was not a bad man. He was a tired man who had deferred to a louder, more aggressive person for too long, and he knew it, and he said so. The community voted to remove Diane from the board, which was a formality at that point given the pending criminal charges, and to expand the board from 3 members to 5 to prevent any single person from having too much control over the HOA's operations. Carolyn Park was elected to fill one of the new seats. Frank Bellamy was elected to fill another. There was a round of genuine, warm applause that felt completely different from anything I had ever seen at an HOA meeting before. Teresa announced that the HOA's insurance carrier had been contacted, and that there was a real possibility the community would recover a significant portion of the stolen funds through the HOA's crime and fidelity coverage, which the community hadn't even known they had. Diane's personal assets were also subject to a civil recovery action that the HOA was pursuing alongside the criminal case. She also announced that the independent review of past fines had been completed and that 17 fines issued over the previous 2 years had been found to be improperly applied and would be refunded with interest. Tom Herrera's towing bill was covered. The Nguyen family got their basketball hoop fine back, plus a formal apology from the board, and their kids were out in the driveway with the hoop the following weekend. My contract was formally renewed and amended at that meeting as well. The new board added language explicitly confirming that contracted service vehicles were not subject to idling rules while performing contracted services, and they also gave me a modest rate increase that I had not asked for but genuinely appreciated. Teresa said it was the board's way of acknowledging that the contract had been poorly managed on their side. I thanked her and told her I looked forward to a much simpler rest of the winter. She laughed and said she thought that was probably achievable now. Diane's criminal case moved through the system over the following months. She hired a defense attorney who argued that the transfers had been legitimate operating expenses that had been informally documented in a system that was admittedly disorganized. The prosecution, which had the banking records, the personal account, the deposit timings, and Gerald's testimony about being told the documentation was filed separately, was not particularly worried about that argument. Diane eventually accepted a plea agreement, pled guilty to misappropriation of funds, paid full restitution to the HOA, and received a suspended sentence with 3 years of probation and 150 hours of community service. The community service requirement was a thing that several people in Maplewood Estates found quietly, deeply satisfying. I found out about the plea from Teresa, who emailed me with the news along with a note that said the HOA's insurance claim had been approved, and the community would be receiving just over $8,000 in restitution from the insurer, with the remainder coming from Diane's personal restitution payment. The reserve fund was whole again. The community was in good shape. I read that email sitting at my kitchen table on a cold February afternoon, watching the snow come down outside my window. It was snowing steadily, the fat, slow kind of snow that accumulates fast and settles in thick layers on everything. The plow blade was already attached to my truck, and I had already let the engine run for a good solid 20 minutes in my driveway to get it properly warmed up, because it was below zero, and I was not going to damage my equipment by running it cold, and there was nobody left in Maplewood Estates who was going to find me for it. When I pulled out onto Maplewood Lane to start the first pass, the snow was already 4 inches deep and coming down hard. I could see lights on in all the houses, the warm yellow glow of people inside where it was heated and comfortable, and I thought about how different things looked from inside a warm house versus from outside in the cold, and how a lot of conflicts are really just a failure to understand that difference. I made my first pass and the snow curled off the blade and the road came clear behind me. I made my second pass and cleaned up the edges. I cleared the turnaround in the mailbox area, and by the time I was done the whole neighborhood was passable again, and the snow was still coming down and would need another pass in a few hours. Frank Bellamy came out of his house as I was finishing up, dressed in his big puffy coat, and gave me a thumbs up from his front step. I gave him a wave back. On my way back to my driveway, I passed the spot where Diane's house was. There was a for sale sign in the front yard. She had moved out shortly after the plea agreement. The house had gone on the market quickly. Someone new was already scheduled to move in by the end of the month, a young couple with a dog and, reportedly, a cheerful indifference to HOA politics. I pulled into my garage and shut the engine off and sat there for a minute in the quiet. It had started with a $100 fine for idling my truck on a cold morning. It had ended with a criminal conviction, a community that had woken up, a properly functioning HOA, 17 families who had gotten their money back, a for sale sign on a bully's former lawn, and a neighborhood that could actually get in and out on a snowy day. Not bad for a Tuesday. I went inside, hung up my coat, washed my hands, and started making a big pot of chili because it was the kind of cold day where chili was the only sensible response. I had the radio on, and it was talking about another system coming in next week, 8 to 12 inches, which meant I was going to be busy. I did not mind that one bit. There was a knock at my door around 6. I figured it was Frank or maybe Carolyn, but when I opened it, it was Teresa, standing on my front step with a covered dish and a bottle of wine. "Peace offering from the HOA," she said. "Or technically from me personally, since the HOA can't really bring you a casserole, but the sentiment is on behalf of everyone." I opened the door wider. "Come in," I said. "There's chili on the stove." She came in and set the casserole on my kitchen counter and looked around the house in the easy way that neighbors do when they have finally crossed a threshold they should have crossed a long time ago. "You know," she said, "when I moved into this neighborhood 18 months ago, I thought Diane was just kind of intense. It took me a while to see the pattern." "It usually does," I said. "People like that are good at making each individual thing seem like it's just a rule being enforced. It's only when you zoom out that the pattern becomes visible." "You saw it," she said. "I've dealt with HOAs before," I said, which was the truth. This was not my first rodeo with an HOA that had gotten too big for its own britches. I had learned from experience to put that suspension clause in contracts. I had learned from experience to document everything and know the rules better than the people who were using them against me. "Well," Teresa said, pouring 2 glasses of wine, "the new board is going to be different. I can promise you that." "I believe you," I said, and I meant it. We had dinner and talked about the neighborhood and about what the spring would look like once the snow was gone and things could be properly assessed. There was some deferred maintenance on the road surface that needed attention, and the reserve fund, now properly restored, could cover it. There were some landscaping decisions that had been stuck in limbo because Diane had been the only one managing them and had let them sit. The new board had a lot of catching up to do, but Teresa seemed energized rather than overwhelmed by it. Outside, the snow kept falling on Maplewood Lane, steady and patient and indifferent to all human drama. The road was clear. The neighborhood was quiet. The lights were on in all the houses. Eventually Teresa left and I cleaned up and let the dog out for a few minutes before bed. The dog standing in the snow with that deeply philosophical expression that dogs get when they're outside in winter and can't quite decide if they like it or not. I thought, standing there in the cold dark with the snow coming down around me, about how close the whole thing had been to just being a petty, forgotten argument over $100 fine. If I had just paid the fine and gone and plowed the road, nothing would have changed. Diane would have kept issuing fines. She would have kept moving money into her personal account in careful, invisible increments. The community would have kept paying assessments and grumbling and not going to HOA meetings. But I had the suspension clause, and I had been cold enough and fed up enough and certain enough about the absurdity of what had happened to use it. And the road had sat unplowed for a day, and that had been enough to wake people up and get them looking. And what they found when they actually looked was everything. Sometimes the right move is to just drive off and leave the road unplowed. Let people see what was actually keeping things running, and who was making it unnecessarily hard, and what happens when you stop working around the problem and make the problem visible instead. I called the dog back inside and wiped his paws and locked the door and turned off the kitchen light. First plow run of the morning was at 6. I'd let the truck run for 25 minutes before I started. Nobody was going to stop me. I went to bed listening to the snow fall, quiet and steady, on a neighborhood that was, for the first time in a long time, actually functioning the way a neighborhood was supposed to. And that was, all things considered, a pretty good way to end a winter.